Okay, well, we're going to go ahead and get started because we do want to be respectful of your time and be out of here at 8 o'clock, but we've got a lot to cover tonight. So again, my name is Janet Grant and I'm the Vice Chair of Fair Districts, Georgia, and I'll be serving as an MC, but tonight, and we're calling it the Ken Show tonight. So Ken Lawler, our Chair of Fair Districts Georgia, is going to be walking us through what I think is going to be a really provocative conversation on this issue about extreme legislation and how gerrymandering feeds into that. And he's done a lot of background work, as you're going to see, to look at what that looks like in Georgia. And we've also got some examples from other states that have been bubbling up lately. And then we're going to spend some time talking about our project that we're going to be launching tonight in terms of asking candidates across Georgia to take a pledge around fair redistricting. So excited for that conversation as well. If you have questions along the way, we do have everyone muted. We are recording this. We do also have live transcription available, as you probably can see on your screen as well. But if you've got questions along the way, please put those in the chat. Barbara's with us tonight. She's going to be answering questions that we can answer along the way, and other questions we'll be coming back to in the Q&A. We're going to leave plenty of time at the end for Q&A for a discussion with Ken on all the content that we've got. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ken and the Ken Show.
Thank you, Janet. There we go. I'm unmuted now. Thank you, Janet, and welcome everybody. I'll add my welcome to Janet's. Good to see that we have a mix of folks who've been with us before and folks who are just joining us. We're at a really interesting moment in our journey towards fair redistricting, in that we're going to kick off tonight for the first time ever a campaign pledge, and we'll talk about that, where we ask candidates to pledge for fair redistricting. So all of you didn't know this, but by coming to our meeting tonight, you're actually going to be volunteers. We hope you will be volunteers anyway. We'll talk about that in a minute. We had a town hall. Our last town hall was in May. And at that town hall, we had a very interesting presentation from a person from, I think it was Emory University, talking about how gerrymandering affects healthcare because of the way state policies are determined in states that have gerrymandered districts. We're continuing that theme tonight. We wanted to do a little bit deeper dive into some additional areas where gerrymandering leads to extreme legislation or controversial legislation. That's the first topic we're going to talk about. And then secondly, we're going to talk about how can we stop it? And that's announcing our candidate pledge campaign, where we're going to go out and ask our candidates for state, House, and Senate and other offices to pledge to stop to reform redistricting. And you can all be part of that. And that's the second topic we're going to cover tonight. So again, as Janet said, put your questions in the chat. Now, look, for those of you who have been with us before, you've seen the story about the harms of gerrymandering, right? This is the story. This is the logic. It says, when you have non-competitive districts in your elections, it's a lack of voter choice. That means the real competition is in the party primaries. That means you get representatives who either represent the far left or the far right in many districts. It leads to one party control of your legislature, our legislature, because they don't fear losing the next election. And so the upshot of all that is legislation can be driven not by voter preferences, what the voters of the state want, but by the party that got elected. The party that got elected says, hey, we're the Republicans or the Democrats, we got elected, therefore we get to run the show and whatever we say goes, right? And the question is, has this really happened in Georgia, right? Well, we in Fair District certainly believe it has happened. And tonight we're going to talk about some of the evidence we have of that. A lot of these things we've talked about before, the one-party control and the gerrymandering, we'll talk about that. We're going to focus a lot of our time tonight on understanding, so what's the impact on legislation? Because at the end of the day, that's where the rubber meets the road. So as a backdrop to this discussion, I want to give you a little bit of history that I discovered this past week, which is really fascinating. So we in Georgia have a 150-year history of gerrymandering in state government. From 1872 to 2002, our governor and General Assembly, all of those were Democrats for really literally 130 years. And the 1 second while I just take my screen fix here. Oh, back here. Sorry. In 2003 and 2004, things started to change. The first Republican governor since Reconstruction was elected. That was Sonny Perdue. The state Senate was elected as 30 Democrats and 26 Republicans, but poor Democrats thought they saw the writing on the wall and they switched parties after the election. And so the Senate in 2003 was a Republican Senate, but the state house stayed Democratic. So for that 2-year period, we had divided government. But since 2005, we've had this Republican trifecta where, right, it's been all Republican since then. 12 state legislators agreed to join that party and basically switched parties sometime during that time frame. So think about it, though. In 150 years, we've had only 2 years in the state where government has been divided, where the parties were forced to work with each other. And some interesting things happened in that point, but we're going to cover most of our effort tonight is going to be looking at what's happened over this last 20-year period. Now, over this last 20-year period, when we look at the statewide vote share in our state, we can see the switch. We can see that in 2000, the Republicans won the statewide vote share. Statewide votes meaning president, governor, U.S. Senate, the big races, right? In 2000, that statewide vote share was in favor of the Democrats. This red line gives you the Republican view. The Democrats' view is the mirror image. Since 2002, however, the Republicans have enjoyed a majority, but now 2018 and 20, we've arrived in this interesting place called a swing state, right? And that swing state status is very interesting because we've now started to see some changes in the way legislators operate and votes have become a lot closer. So being a swing state now, we expect that this election coming up is going to look different, right? And indeed, the 2020 election was very different in terms of, electing, voting for a Democratic president and 2 Democratic senators, of course, right? Again, we just look at these numbers and say, we don't favor one party over the other. We're a nonpartisan organization, but it's important to understand the trend that has kind of led us to this moment, right? So what's happened, though, in this last 20 years is that, of course, we've had a lot of gerrymandering, right? And therefore, we've had a lot of uncontested races in Georgia. This graphic shows you the history of uncontested races for the state General Assembly, the House and the Senate. And you can see that over this time period, we've had anywhere from, say, 50 to 80% of our races uncontested. Well, that indicates a state where voting is fairly polarized, but also then, people are discouraged from running if they believe there's no chance of winning. Right? It means you have a lot of uncontested races. It also means a lot of safe seats. And safe seats is where we get into the trouble, where legislators don't think their job is at risk. And so they are free to pursue their agenda that they think their partisans want. And that's exactly what we are observing now, as I'm probably preaching to the choir when I tell all the folks here tonight that story. But what we intend to do tonight is give you a little bit more background on it, right? Now, in 2020 and 2022, the uncontested races are down in the 50% range. This is a good thing, right? We believe that the more competition breeds excellence in business. There's no reason why it shouldn't breed excellence in government as well. However, we're still behind the national average, where in state houses and senates across the nation in 2020, 65% of the districts were contested, 35% uncontested. So Georgia still runs a little bit behind. But the nature of our state is that we don't have a lot of swing territory. We had a lot of deep red spaces in the state and a lot of deep Democratic places in the state. So we'll probably never see every race in the state contested, but we probably could do better than 50%. At least that's my judgment. Now, let's take a look at one election in particular. Let's look at the 2020 election and talk about voter choice. So again, this was a very well attended election. It was record turnout, right? 5 million people voted for the president and about the same number in the Senate races. Let's look, however, at what happened when you got to the state house. So of those 5 million people who had to vote in a very competitive president race, when you look at the state house and the state Senate, the green section of the bar, right? Only 12% of those voters cast a vote in what we would consider to be a competitive race in the House, and it was even less than that in the Senate. I think the number's around 9%, right? And a competitive race to us is anything less than a 55% win or a 5-point win. So only 12% of the voters had a real genuine choice in terms of a race that was competitive that could have been tossed either way. Another 39% of the votes were cast in contested races, but they weren't very competitive. So it's fairly one-sided. Even if you have a lot of competition in terms of contested races because of the nature of our state and the polarization of our state. We get a lot of non-competitive races. Another 40% of the votes were cast in races where there was no competition. It was one, there's one candidate on the ballot. You can choose that person or not. And another 9% of the votes, or almost 450,000 voters, didn't even bother to vote in a state Senate or a state House race because they didn't feel like they had a choice, right? And that's what happened. So the net of this is that voters don't get a lot of choice. That there's some races where there is choice, but it's the minority of the races where there's a genuine choice, right? And so again, if you're a politician, you've been elected, you can look at these numbers and say, well, I think I'm in pretty safe territory most of the time. And that then leads to the kinds of opportunities to construct one-sided legislation. Now, there's two questions that we want to ask when we look at, does gerrymandering affect what goes on in our legislature? First of all, are legislators even listening to what voters want, right? That's a key question. That's a very, very important question. Because there's a lot of public opinion polls that are released that try to inform the legislators what voters want. And are legislators even listening to those voters, right? And are they listening to voters on both sides of the aisle? And then the second question is, can we look at the actual votes that they're taking in the legislature, and can we see whether gerrymandered maps affect the outcome of those votes? I'll tell you it's hard, but we're going to give it a shot here tonight. We have chosen 4 issues to focus on as samples. One is redistricting itself. That is an issue, right? It's a bit of a wonky issue. It relates to the how elections work. It's not so much a policy issue. And then we've chosen 3 policy issues: gun rights, Medicaid expansion, and reproductive rights, right? Those other 3 are obviously generally pretty contentious issues in Georgia. There has been a lot of legislation and activity of late in all these areas. We're going to look at some of those in some detail and show you what goes on inside the legislature. Now, I want to make one disclaimer, is that we're going to be talking about policies other than redistricting. And those policies other than redistricting, Fair Districts Georgia expresses no opinion on the merits or demerits of these policies, whether there should be gun rights, where they're reproductive. We don't take a position on these issues in terms of, well, there should or shouldn't be looser gun laws, right? We don't take any position. Our position is that the laws that are passed should reflect what voters want. That is really the key thing we're trying to figure out, is that happening? And as you'll see, in many cases it is not, and that's what raises our concern. So that's my disclaimer when I get to talking about gun rights and Medicaid and reproductive rights. So let's take the first issue, redistricting, right? What do voters really want? First step, what do voters really want, right? Well, look, we know what voters want because many of us, and I'm sure many of you tonight, helped us articulate this. Many of us testified at hearings in 2021 in the summer. We told legislators that we wanted 2 things: fair maps that reflect political preferences, not favoring one party over the other. We want those maps to reflect the racial and ethnic diversity of the state. We become a very diverse state, as our census shows. And we want them to comply with the Voting Rights Act, which means they should have enough opportunities for minority groups to elect candidates of their choice. And we also want a fair process. We want a process that's transparent, where the public can see and get involved in what's going on, a process that eliminates the inherent conflicts of interest when legislators draw their own lines. And obviously, the preferred model that we've expressed for years has been an independent commission. That would be the best way to do this. Georgia is not alone in these thoughts. Here's a national survey that looks at, the top graph is, views of gerrymandering bipartisanship. And you can see that, gerrymandering is considered a bad thing by Democrats, independents, and Republicans across the board, by enough majority where you say it's plain and obvious that people don't like gerrymandering in this country, right? And then the bottom graph says, well, what % of people think that an independent redistricting commission would be the best choice? And the answer is 55 to 69%, depending on your political persuasion, right? And so, it's pretty obvious to us that that's what voters want, and we think that this would mirror the opinions of Georgians as a national survey. So what do we get, though? What we get is gerrymandering. We've been constantly gerrymandered, and we've only studied it back to the 2001, 2000 timeframe. But we've had gerrymandering. It's very clear, right? In 2001, the Democrats were in charge. A party line vote enacted gerrymandered maps. They were packed Republican districts, maximized Democratic districts. That gerrymander was so bad it was overturned by Supreme Court in 2004. So that was a bad one. The Republicans have had two shots at it since then after the 2010 and 2020 censuses. Both times they have tilted the maps in their favor. After the 2011-2012 redistricting, they achieved a supermajority in the Senate and almost a supermajority in the House, despite their vote share being declining. If you remember that graph that I showed you, their vote share declined, and yet they achieved a supermajority. And of course, last year, the redistricting cycle we just went through, Republicans were able to lock in majorities in all three maps, despite a less than 50% vote share in 2020, right? It was a very close election. We all know that, right? And those maps disadvantaged minority voters, and there's 5 federal lawsuits still pending against those maps. In addition, in that time frame of 2005 to 21, there was a lot of mid-cycle redistricting where, without waiting for the census, the parties involved said, let's just change some districts to make them easier to win. And so we see that as a constant battle. So here's an example. Take this issue, redistricting. Voters say they don't want gerrymandering, they want fairness. That's not what we're getting, which would say that legislators are not listening to voters on this. And of course, it's in their best interest to do it, because guess what? They can easily get reelected. Gerrymandering begets more gerrymandering. This graph you may have seen before, which talks about that history and says, going back in the 2000 time frame, right? The Democrats lost the statewide vote share for the first time in the 2002 election, but they still held on to both chambers of the legislature until those Republicans, 4 Democrats switched seats in the Senate, but the House stayed as a Democratic House. And as time goes on, you've seen the Republican, that red line is the same line you saw in a prior graph. The red line says that the vote share has been gradually declining to the point where in 2020, it's now a swing state vote. And yet they've achieved this supermajority. That supermajority has been eroded, but it still exists as a majority, even though we're at a swing state status, right? So again, we've seen a lot of gerrymandering. You've heard that story from us before. So let's go now and talk about another issue. And again, let's talk about gun rights. And again, I'll repeat, we don't take a position on what's right or wrong with respect to gun rights, other than what do voters want and are we listening, right? So if you just look at a few, talking points or a few issues around gun rights, right? Some of this data is from national research, from Pew Research, and some of it is from Georgia specific. But, preventing the mentally ill from buying guns, overwhelming majorities say that should happen. Georgia laws don't have any such restriction. Universal background checks, everybody's heard about this one, and that's, overwhelming from both parties. Georgia doesn't have that. Banning human assault weapons in high capacity magazines, almost 2/3 of voters think that's a smart idea. Georgia doesn't care, right? Our laws don't care. More recently, we've had 3 laws that were passed. 2 laws were about expanding permission to carry guns in more places. There was one in 2014 called the Safe Carrier Protection Act. The AJC, Atlanta Journal-Constitution, as you know, runs a helpful poll almost every year in January. They run a poll before the legislative session exploring issues that they think are going to be of interest. And in that poll in 2014, 70% of Georgians said they oppose the idea of expanding permission to carry guns in more places, like churches and businesses, and even the public place, the non-secure areas of the airport. What did we get? We got an act that did that anyway, right? Then in 2017, there was a law called the Campus Carry Act, where in the 2014 bill, they left out the idea of carrying guns on college campuses. Well, they added it back in 2017, even though 54% of Georgians said that's a bad idea. Now that 54% was pretty polarized. Democrats said really bad idea. Democrats said, well, it's probably okay with us, right? So the legislature listened to the Republicans, and boom, we got a Campus Carry Act. And then, of course, in this legislative session just finished in January, a new provision to allow concealed carry without a permit. Again, that was 70% opposed, including a majority from both parties, but we got the bill anyway. So clear on gun rights that legislators are not listening. They're just not listening to what voters really want, and that's a big problem. Now, can we answer the second question, though, is if we look at the actual votes on these bills, can we see whether the gerrymandered maps that we've been living under actually affected the votes? Now, I'll tell you, this is the hard part, okay? We've done a lot of work to try to figure this out, and I'll take you through few examples of this. And I will say that it's not 100% proof, but you can see where the effect might happen. So let's take a look at one of these laws, the campus carry law in 2017, right? So in the 2016 election that preceded this legislative session, here's what we got. State House was elected as 118 Republicans, 62 Democrats. So that's a pretty big majority for the Republicans in the State House. And on the Senate side, it was 38 Republican, 18 Democrat. But if we look at the votes for the bill in the State House, only 96 people voted for the Campus Carry Act. That was 95 of the Republicans and 1 Democrat. Voting against was actually 70, so 12 Republicans and 58 Democrats. And not voting or excused was actually 14 people. Now, what happens in some of these controversial bills is that if the majority party believes they don't need all the votes in their party, they allow certain legislators to what's called taking a walk. Means you can actually just leave the chamber, go to the restroom, take a drink of water, whatever, while the vote's being taken, and you don't have to be on record as having voted for that controversial bill. And some of these votes, people were just not there during the day, so it's either not voting or excused. But there's a significant number of legislators in these controversial bills that just don't vote because they fear that voting for or against that bill could be very detrimental to their reelection, right? And so you see a lot of that, right? So if we look at the State House, for example, the win margin on this was 6. So you need 91 votes to pass a law in the State House because we have a 90-90 is an even split. They had 96. The win margin was 6. Now, our estimate from working with Princeton Gerrymandering Project last year said that the bias in the maps was probably somewhere between 1 and 7 seats in favor of the Republicans. So what does that mean? It means that if you had a fair map, let's suppose that the map bias had been corrected and 6 of the seats would have been designed better for Democrats instead. Well, maybe you would not have had enough votes to pass this bill in the State House because you only had 96 or a margin of 6. So when we see that the win margin is within the range of the estimated map bias, we start to say, well, there's a chance that that bill might not have passed had the map been different. Now, that's not an ironclad proof because it's hard to know what the dynamics look like. If the chamber's made up a little bit differently, is there more crossover voting? You really just don't know. It depends on who got elected. There's so many variables. But as best as we can tell, when you have a map that tilts one way or the other, right, that could easily affect who gets elected. And if the votes are primarily party line, which many times they are, then that win margin could certainly be affected. On the Senate side, it's a similar story. Win margin was 5 votes, with 4 Republicans voting against the bill, no Democrats voting for it. Win margin was 5. We think the map bias was somewhere between 1 and 6. Again, depends on how far the map got corrected. But again, that's a case where possibly a different map would have had a different makeup of the chamber, and therefore this bill might not have passed. But if we go back to 2014, the Safe Carrier Protection Act, that's not the case, right? Here, what you've got is the win margin on these bills. In the House, it was 13, with an estimated map bias of about 1 to 8 in that time frame. Probably would not have made a difference. And the same thing would be true on the Senate, where you had an estimated win margin of 8, a win margin on the vote of 8, the estimated map bias only 1 to 4. Probably that bill would have passed even if the map had been fair. Again, these are our best judgment. There's no way to know for sure, but that is what it looks like when you look at the win margin versus the estimated map bias. Okay. Okay. And the last one, the constitutional carry one that just passed. Let's look at this one, right? So the win margin on the vote in January was 10. It passed 100 to 67. It was an entirely party line vote in the House. All the Republicans voted for it. All the Democrats voted against it. 12 people were excused or took a walk. The win margin was 10. Map bias 1 to 8. It's probably difficult to prove that a fair map would in fact have affected that vote, but it certainly could have been a lot closer, right? If the win margin's only 10. On the Senate side, however, the win margin was only 4. Again, a highly polarized vote. It was all one way or the other. The map bias of 1 to 4, that could have made a difference, right? There was an interesting quote that I found from a prominent politician where he was asked, I'll say it was a he, but I won't tell you who it was. that said, well, how can you justify this law in light of the fact that Georgians didn't think it was a good idea? Remember, the polls said, some 70% think it's a bad idea. And the answer was, well, the answer was, hold on one second. The answer was that the Georgia politicians said, well, if they didn't call me and ask, then it doesn't count, right? So that really they're saying the poll really doesn't affect what they think is the bottom line, right? So that's a view of the gun situation. I'm told that my sound may be a little bit not very good. I'll try to speak a little more slowly and distinctly and see if that helps. Hopefully you all can hear me all right. So let's go to the next area, Medicaid expansion, right? So here's the background. Background on this one was that in 2010, the Affordable Care Act, the federal act, offered to cover 90 to 100% of costs to states to expand Medicaid up to 138% of the federal poverty level. Georgia is one of the 12 states that have not expanded. There are pros and cons to this bill. We won't get into what's the right answer. We don't take a position on what's the right answer. I'll just say that there are clearly pros and cons to the bill. So this was being considered back in the 2014 timeframe after the Affordable Care Act was passed and after some Supreme Court decisions upheld the act, right? So in 2014, what did voters want Georgia to do? Well, 57% were in favor of Georgia expanding Medicaid to that degree in 2014. Again, it was a polarized view. 90% of Democrats liked it. 25% of Republicans did. Only 25% of Republicans liked it. What happened? Well, the legislature passed two bills. The most important was HB 990. The way Medicaid expansion worked was that the governor had the authority under the Affordable Care Act to unilaterally request to do the Medicaid expansion. The Republican legislator feared that a Democrat might win the governorship, and so they passed a bill that prohibited that from happening, saying you got to go through the legislature. And another bill, 943, prohibited state agencies from advocating or supporting Medicaid expansion. 2017, there was another poll on Medicaid expansion. Now we're at 75% in favor. 2019, we're at 71% in favor. Finally, Georgia did a very small partial expansion of Medicaid that was very narrow. It was not the full scope. It would cover a fraction of the number of people. It would still cost a lot of money. And it included work or community service requirements. And so that was the voters' view at the time that SB 106 was passed. We'll take a quick look at those vote margins again, right? So back in 2014, the HB 990 had a 28 win margin. No way would have a different map affected a 28 vote margin. It wouldn't have happened. And the state Senate, again, the margin is way outside the estimated map bias, 7 versus 1 to 4. Same thing is true on the other bill that was passed in 2014. The win margins are much greater than the map bias in those cases. But the more recent bill, the partial Medicaid expansion, actually was a much closer deal, right? On the state House side, the win margin was 14 votes. Again, there was some crossover votes you'll see in the House. 6 Democrats voted for that. 3 Republicans voted against it. Win margin was 14. The estimated map bias being 1 to 8. Again, probably outside the range where it could have been affected. But on the Senate side, there was only a 4-vote win margin. 3 Republicans actually did not vote on that bill. And so with only a 4-win margin, with the map being tilted 1 to 4, well, you can say that could have been affected. That might have not passed. And the Democrats could have held out for a full Medicaid expansion instead, which is what they were proposing. So what happened? The bill passed. The proposal that was released for public comment in Georgia, the public comments were almost, 90% opposed the proposal that was out for public comment. Only 4% of people were in favor of it. Not to leave you hanging, what's going on with this since then is that proposal was approved by the Trump Health and Human Services Administration. The Biden administration came along and said, nope, we don't like it. Now it's engaged in litigation. The Kemp administration is suing the federal government to try to get the approval that they got in 2020 reinstated. We'll see how that turns out. Again, we don't take an opinion one way or the other than we should be listening to the voters when it comes to this. I will say it's not all bad news, though. We have had some notable bipartisan healthcare wins. 2020, Medicaid expanded postpartum care for mothers from 60 days after the date of birth to 6 months, unanimous votes. 2022, they extended it to 1 year. Again, huge bipartisan majorities favoring that. And the Mental Health Parity Act, which was a signature achievement of this legislative session just passed, unanimous votes in favor. So it can be done. When they want to work together, they can. But when there's a partisan divide, it's subject to the whim of the majority party. Last case I'll talk about is reproductive rights, obviously a very sensitive issue. We'll start in 2019. What happened here was that, if you remember your history, Brian Kemp was running for governor in 2018. He was elected on a narrow margin. One of his signature issues was he wanted to further restrict abortion in the state of Georgia. So he won, and the Republican legislature was elected again in 2019. So the AJC ran a poll in late March, early April, and asked some key questions. What do you think about abortion? And the answer was that 57% of Georgians thought that it should be legal in either all or most cases. Only 36% should it be illegal in either all or most cases. People were asked, should we overturn Roe v. Should the Supreme Court overturn Roe v. Wade? 70% opposed, not quite a majority of Republicans, only 49%, but the rest across the board were very high. Only 43% of Republicans supported overturning Roe v. Wade, and almost no Democrats or independents. So again, people were generally opposed to the idea of overturning that law. And then the AJC polled on the law that was under consideration, this 6-week abortion ban with some exceptions. Narrowly opposed by 48%, but highly polarized, right? Republicans liked the law, 70%. Democrats did not like the law, 67%. And the independents tended to side with the Democrats on that one, right? So what happened was we got the law. We got the Heartbeat Act. It's called the Heartbeat Bill by some people, but the technical term, the real name is the Living Infants, Fairness, and Equity Act. It was passed in 2019. It bans abortion after 6 weeks. There are some important exceptions. It also establishes these personhood rights. As you are aware, probably, that law was on hold until the Supreme Court decision in June. It's now been reinstated. So this is the law of the land in Georgia. Again, we take no position right or wrong, other than, what did voters really want here. The AJC ran another poll this year after the Dobbs decision and asked, let's take a look at the vote margins. A very, very close vote, okay? So in the House, only a 2-vote win margin on a map that we estimate to be biased by 1 to 8. I dare say that on this particular case, I think a different map would have had a different outcome because the vote margin was so close. 10 people didn't vote. It was 92 to 78. Only 1 Democrat voted for it. On the Senate side, the margin was +6. Not within the estimated map bias. Again, the dynamics could change when you have a different map. But I dare say that this probably would not have passed a House had it been elected under a different map and it had been that controversial a piece of legislation. The AJC ran a recent poll in July asking again, well, what do you think now we've seen the Dobbs overturn, we've got the Georgia Act being reinstated, what do you think, right? What voters said was 54% still opposed overturning Roe v. Wade, but it's politically polarized, with Democrats saying bad idea, Republicans liked it. And the Georgia Life Act, 54% opposed, even 26% of Republicans, but again, it's pretty polarized, right? Democrats don't like it, Republicans do. So we've got this it's a very controversial issue. The attitude is polarized, but slim majorities would say that the law is not what Georgians should have. The problem is that it's polarized, and so when you have a polarized legislature, they will listen to one side over the other. Just contrast this with the recent activity that happened in Kansas. You probably saw this last week, but Kansas is a similar situation. They have a gerrymandered legislature. You have a Democratic governor over there. Kansas state court struck down an abortion law several years ago. Voters were asked to change the Constitution this year to allow that law to be reenacted. And overwhelmingly, across the board, huge turnout in a primary, no less, a bipartisan vote across red and blue counties, voters said no, bad idea. So not sure how Georgia would vote if we had that kind of a referendum on the ballot these days, but it's kind of an indication that says, voters think differently than what the legislature wanted in that particular case in Kansas. So kind of a whirlwind tour of some key issues and how gerrymandering might affect that. The question is, how do we break the partisan mentality, right? I mean, the issue we have is that, if you only believe in democracy when your side wins, you don't believe in it. And when you have these polarized legislatures with safe seats and all the things we've talked about, it's very easy just to, listen to the people that vote for you and not think that you really have to listen to the folks who don't vote for you, right? So how do we break that mentality? Well, it starts with getting legislature to commit to changing redistricting. At least that's one key aspect, and that's what we're here to say. So we are tonight announcing our candidate pledge campaign. This has three objectives. Number one is we want to get candidates to take a position on redistricting. They've probably almost forgotten about redistricting because that was last year's issue and it's not this year's issue. We can't let that happen. We need to get candidates in every election, but we're starting this year to take a position on redistricting, saying we want you to take a position for fairness. We also want to get voters to prioritize the issue when they make their decisions. And then we want to connect those two together by saying, make candidates aware that voters want action on this issue. Look, we're realistic that redistricting is not the hottest issue this year, and it may not be a hot issue again until 2030, but we have to keep it in people's minds because it affects all the issues that you do care about, as we've just demonstrated. So we want candidates to take the pledge. Now, here's our objective. We are reaching out to candidates from all parties. This is a nonpartisan activity. We want candidates from all parties for these offices, the state legislature, governor, lieutenant governor, secretary of state, to commit to a fair districting pledge. We'll show you what the pledge says in a second. That's 370 candidates that we have to reach to try to get them to commit. We also want to get as many Georgia voters as possible to take this pledge to their candidates. And so what we're going to ask you tonight to do is get involved and pick up the gauntlet here and help us get this pushed out. And we're obviously going to publicize that. Keep in mind that Fair Districts is a nonpartisan organization. We do not advocate for candidates or political parties. We don't support them. We don't give money, none of that stuff. We don't do any electioneering at all. What we want is this issue to be considered to be important. And we want candidates to commit to reforming this process as part of their platforms. Here's the pledge. The pledge basically says that I pledge to support fair redistricting and reform across Georgia to include four things. Number one, a fully transparent process with robust citizen engagement. We got some of that last year, but not nearly enough. Number two is fair maps, validated by independent experts like us or Princeton Gerrymandering Project. And these maps should reflect diversity, communities of interest, and not unnaturally favor any political party. We think these are the principles that ought to be followed. Number three is we want competitive districts that give voters meaningful choices. As you've seen, we don't have a lot of competition for our state legislature, even our congressional districts. And then lastly, we want to halt this mid-cycle redistricting plague that we've seen, and also a thing called prison gerrymandering, where prisoners are counted not where they live, but in the prison areas where they're incarcerated, which affects districts that have prisons in them and affects their home districts because they don't get proper representation. So this is the pledge. We're not saying here's a law that we want enacted. We want these principles to be agreed to. And if we can get these principles agreed to, we can then work on specific legislation to implement those as we go forward. So that's the pledge. How's the campaign going to work? Fair Districts is going to send a letter or an email, to all targeted candidates. We're going to ask you as local volunteers to follow up with your candidates and maybe some candidates in neighboring areas. We're going to be emailing everybody on our mailing list, our social media followers, folks who've been involved with us in the past with letters to the editor and postcard writers, and we're going to work through partners who also believe this is important. We also want you to raise this question to candidates in public forums and fundraisers. If you go to candidate meetings, ask them, do you commit to fair redistricting? I've got the pledge right here. Will you please sign it? That's a fair question. And we also want you to publicize your efforts on social media. Let us know on our social media channels. What are you seeing? And, have you talked to candidates and what are the responses? Now, how can you get involved? So at this point of the program, I would like to introduce Nancy Nethery, our pledge campaign organizer. However, Nancy Nethery had a family emergency and is unable to be here tonight. So I'm Nancy for tonight. But the thing you're going to do is we'd like you to sign up by sending an email to pledge@fairdistrictsga.org so that you can say, yes, I'd like to get involved. Help me out. Right now, I'm going to tell you, you're going to get a copy of all these slides. I'm going to give you a whole bunch of tips and techniques. We're going to post a copy of all these slides so you have this. Don't feel like you got to scramble and write all this stuff down. But I'm going to walk through it pretty quickly here so we can open it up for questions and answers. So send an email and say, I'd like to help. The next step would be to find the candidates to approach. We'll tell you how to find your candidates. Let us know which candidates you'll be working on, and then go to ask them about registering. Approach those candidates. You can email them, you can talk to them and say, will you take the pledge? And we want the candidate to return the pledge to that email. So the volunteers do not have to collect these pledges. We want the volunteers to say to the candidates, please take the pledge, hand them the pledge, they sign it, they then scan a picture of it and send it back to us at pledge@fairdistrictsga.org. And on our website, we have a new web page going up today called Candidate Pledge. I'll show you that website in a second. That's where you will see some other resources and a scorecard of which candidates have agreed and which have not agreed. Okay, so that's the basic idea. Now, what are the tactics? So how do you find your candidates? Well, there's a thing called My Voter Page. I hope everybody's aware of it, but if you're not, it's myvoterpage.sos.ga.gov. Again, you'll get a copy of this. At My Voter Page, you can figure out what districts you are in, and then we'll show you how to get to your candidates from there. So this is the front page of My Voter Page. What you'll do is you'll sign in with your last name, first initial, county, and date of birth. You'll log in. You'll be taken to a page that says, here's your information. You probably can't read the details. That's okay. Down at the bottom, there's a thing called View the Precinct Card. You click that button. That button takes you to this page, which is the precinct card that they would normally send you in the mail. And you can see that your district numbers are listed there. In this particular case, this person, their district for the House is 90 and their Senate seat is 42. And I just want to make a plug while you're here. Please check your voter registration. There have been some issues in the last 18 months or so with automatic voter registration been turned off in Georgia. If you have renewed your driver's license or moved or anything, it's possible that they have not renewed your registration. Please go check your voter registration using this My Voter Page. Perfect opportunity to do it. Anyway, once you know your district numbers, 90 for the House and 42 for the Senate, you can then go to our Fair Districts Candidate Pledge page, and I'll do a live demo of this if I have time in just a second. And what you can do is there's a search box at the top, and you'll type in the search box the district number. So in this case, this person typed in District 42, which was their Senate district, and lo and behold, they can see that there's only one candidate for that district. It happens to be a person named Elena Parent. And so they can now approach Elena Parent and say, would you please sign the pledge? But you can look up any district number from your state house or state senate, or you can look up the governor or lieutenant governor. All the target legislators, all the target candidates are on that list. And so you'll be able to do that using our candidate pledge page on our website. Now, what to expect as a volunteer? Well, you're going to get these slides, and once you've sent your email in, Nancy will get back to you. She's going to run this program, so she'll, I'm sure, evolve this as we go. But as a team, she'll have touch bases if you want to check in with her or ask her for help, or she may ask folks to get together once in a while for periodic updates to see how things are going, see if we need to change anything. We do not expect this to succeed at first try. We're going to send these emails to all these candidates. I will tell you that candidates routinely ignore pledges. They get them from everybody, right? They get them from, organizations pushing all sorts of things. The only way this is going to work, frankly, is if all of us get out and actually literally pester candidates, ask them, go to their events, approach them in person, send emails to them. Nancy can get you their email addresses. That's the only way this is going to work, because these pledges, they're going to be swimming in them between now and November. So we're trying to get started early here and ask you to reach out to people. We expect it might take 2 or 3 tries to get a candidate. Remind them, have you signed the pledge yet? Have you signed the pledge yet? That's what it's going to take. Postcard writing, phone follow-up, social media. There's many ways to go about getting candidates engaged on this. But the important thing is that even though we, Fair Districts, are sending this email, we want you locally to say, I'm your constituent and I want you to sign this pledge, right? That's what will be effective, is if people ask their candidates to sign the pledge. Now, if you'd like to help with candidates besides your own, you can find the candidates for literally any district in the state by looking at our webpage, which is looking at our Georgia Explorer map. And I think I'm going to do a very quick demo of this, very, very short, so you can see how this works. So let me switch to, I think I have to stop sharing, new share here. Hopefully you can see my website now. I think you can. So this is our Fair Districts GA website. If I go up here to mapping and I click on the Georgia Explorer map, it brings up a page that lets me open a map. This is our interactive map for the entire state of Georgia. I'm going to select on here state house maps from 2021. I'm just going to say, show me the streets background layer so I can see where these districts are. Then I'm going to do a search. I'm going to say, well, what if I want to go help out in Statesboro? It's one of my favorite little communities because it's a split city. If I click on Statesboro, it brings me up a map of Statesboro, and I can see that surrounding Statesboro is House District 159. Over here in the southeast is 160. And as I roll over here to 158, the west, I can see there's 3 districts. So I could say, if I want to help out Statesboro, I could then go back to the page on this website, which has the candidate pledge. And let me just bring up that page real quickly for you. And you can see how easy the search is. And I'm going to go search for those districts. I'm going to say, show me 158. And sure enough, there's a district with 2 candidates, Butch Parrish and Madeline Ryan Smith. So now I can approach those 2 candidates. Same with 159. That happens to be a single candidate district, and 160 is a single. So let's go after them, right? You can use our maps to find any districts across the state and look up who the candidates are in those districts for Senate or House. It all works the same way. Okay. Let me stop sharing there and go back to my slides. And I'm going to just about wrap up here and we'll get to the Q&A. So if you'd like to help out, that's some of the tools you have at your disposal. And obviously Nancy's an expert on these things and help you use these tools and figure out what's the best way to proceed and get folks to sign up. One last thing about the pledge. We are a nonpartisan organization. So we are allowing candidates to publicize their commitment to reform. If they take our pledge, they can say, hey, I took the Fair Districts pledge, but they cannot imply any endorsement by us. It's a one-way street. That's the way it has to be for us to stay nonpartisan. We're asking them to commit to a reform. We are not going to impute any endorsement by Fair Districts because they signed the pledge. Again, we want all the candidates in both parties to sign this pledge. And they're not allowed to use the Fair Districts logo on their website, social media, or in any campaign materials. So if you happen to see that as a result of your activity, you need to report it to us and we will call those candidates and say, nope, that is not allowed. That's not part of the game plan, okay? Okay, I'm gonna stop. I've given you tons of material. I'm gonna stop here and we'll open it up for Q&A. Again, you'll get a copy of all these slides. I'll stop sharing here and we'll go back to the Q&A.
Okay, great. Well, there was a lot to take in, Ken. And I'm sure there are questions. There are a few in the chat already. And let's start with those. And folks, if you've got questions, please go ahead and put them in the chat. We're going to try to get to as many as we can in the few minutes that we have left. So one of the questions on the pledge, Ken, is what are we going to do with the responses?
Great question. So we are going to be maintaining that page on our website showing a scorecard. We probably will be doing some publicity on social media in terms of the total counts of people. We have to avoid singling out particular candidates or saying, hey, there's more Republicans signed up than Democrats or whatever the case is. We're not going to do that. But we are going to be publicizing the fact that reform for redistricting is building across the state. And the more candidates that sign up, it's a better indicator that reform is moving in the right direction. So I think that's generally, Janet, you can probably add a couple points to that if you'd like, but that's my thinking about what happens to it from there.
Yep, and then there's a related question here that we can, I think, answer quickly from Fran. She asked, aren't we reaching out to those serving and not just candidates? Will there be a push in January when the legislature convenes? And I think the easy answer to that is literally all of these targeted races are on the ballot this year. So folks that are serving today as a legislator or in the governor's or lieutenant governor, et cetera, they're all on the ballot. So they're a candidate in addition to being an incumbent. So we are covering all the bases with that. And you're right, in January, we will have a push to talk about this. And we're going to talk in a little bit about something else that we've got coming up that we're going to use in January in order to show the legislature about how important that this is to voters across the state.
Yeah, and the pledges that we get is a good indicator. We can walk into the legislature in January and say, look, we got pledges from, in fact, you signed a pledge, Mr. or Mrs. whatever. Can you make good on it now? Like, thank you for that. Now let's talk about how we can get legislation done, right?
Right. Okay, a question from Donna Court. She asks, can you explain the importance about federal prisons typically located in rural areas? Those prisoners don't get to vote and are historically incarcerated students or citizens and predominantly people of color. Is that correct?
I would say it's probably correct. And I think the issue is that, the districts where there's a big prison population has an artificial bump in their population. And so the citizens in that district who are not incarcerated get proportionately more representation because the legislature doesn't have to represent the people in the prison. They don't live in their district, right? They're counted there, but they don't get a say. They don't vote. So that district is overly advantaged by the citizens who live there. And then on the other same token, the districts where those people are, they'll live long-term when they are released, their voice isn't being heard there either. And so and I know Janet, you studied this issue as well, but fundamentally it's an issue of, certain votes counting, your vote in a district where there's a prison counts more than someone's vote where there isn't a prison because of the way the district was designed to include that population.
And we even have a district, and I'm not remembering the number off the top of my head, in Georgia where something like 12% of the voters are actually the prison population. So it is a significant issue in Georgia, and we see increasingly this being an area of reform across the country. And so we want to put it on the agenda here in Georgia. Let's see if we've got some other questions. Can you talk about HR 1 or what the solution space looks like for mandating fairer maps at the national level? Or could we address this in a future town hall? From Anthony.
Sure. So the status of HR 1, it's now called the Freedom to Vote John R. Lewis Act. It was attempted to be passed in the Senate was that last year or this year? I can't remember the year. Subject to a filibuster naturally. They even tried to carve out filibuster rules so that they could pass this law. Unfortunately, a couple of senators whose names are frequently in the news would not agree to that. So that action is stalled at the federal level. That only affects, however, federal congressional elections. It does not affect state elections. Although I will say that part of that bill is a renewal of the Voting Rights Act, which would strengthen protection. Actually, I should be careful with that. It affects congressional elections, but it also would affect racial gerrymandering provisions. It strengthens those for all elections, whether it's a school board or state legislative or whatever. And it would fundamentally probably partially undo the 2013 Supreme Court decision in which they said, racial bias is no longer an issue in elections. You don't have to be pre-cleared. So it would definitely have an effect. Our Senator Warnock is one of the best champions for it that we have. It's stalled right now. So until we get a different Senate, we're probably not going to see much action there. My personal view is that while we continue to advocate for that, and we've written letters to that effect, we also have to get at the state level because we have a better chance probably at the state level than we do at changing the Senate. It's just it's a long slog. But if you want to write all 100 senators, please go for it because it's the U.S. Senate that really is the block right now on HR 1, or it's now under a different number, but it's called the Freedom to Vote John R. Lewis Act, and we have written to Senator Warnock, actually our whole congressional delegation, saying, by the way, this act would be very useful for preventing gerrymandering in Georgia. So they are completely aware of our view of it. We're stuck at the moment.
Another question from Karen and Bruce Menke, and the question is, what can we individually do with the responses of candidates for our districts?
What you want to do is get the candidate to sign the pledge document. You can download the pledge form off that candidate pledge webpage. I didn't show it to you. It's on the web page. You can download that form and take it with you and hand it to the candidate if they don't have it. And then you're asking the candidate to return that document to us. We think it's the best way to know for sure that the candidate is making the commitment is to ask the candidate to take that step. We know it's a little bit of a burden, but if you just sign it, if the candidate signs it, if you want, you can take a picture of the candidate, sign it, and then post it on social media saying, hey, guess what? My candidate just signed this. That would be great. But in terms of logging it in our tracking, we want the candidate from their candidate email to send that back to us to pledge at fairdistrictsga.org.
Okay, I'm just going to do one other question. We still have some other questions in the chat, but one other question. Mindy's asked a couple of questions in relation to local redistricting and pointing out that in Cobb County, redistricting drew out an elected official whose term doesn't end until 2024. How can we advocate for redistricting not to be used in this way?
Well, that's a great question. It became really a hot mess this January, where in several counties, Cobb was one of them, the legislature usurped the local delegation's authority to draw those maps. It was a bad situation, very bad situation. I know that the Cobb County School Board is currently the subject of a federal lawsuit, I believe. I'm not sure if that's the case that Mindy is discussing or not, but there is one federal lawsuit pending because the school board disadvantaged one or two minority serving incumbents were drawn out of their districts. So, our advocacy for redistricting as we talk about future legislation will include the right process for local redistricting. But again, until we change laws, the best thing you can do is fight it in court. If you believe that a minority candidate was disadvantaged, you can fight that in court under the Voting Rights Act. Still, that's still an avenue that's open. It just takes a while.
And I would just add to that we purposely made the language of the pledge broad so that it would encompass the idea of all redistricting across our state, not just the state legislative seats, but also local redistricting. We agree with you. We saw a lot of concerning behavior during local redistricting this year. And that's another area that we definitely want to focus on in the future. An interesting example out of the state of California, they have an independent redistricting commission. It's probably one of the best states in the country in terms of having a very fair and open process now. And that law was passed they had one passed in 2008 and one in 2010. So they're through their second cycle now. And what they did was they then went back in 2019 and passed a law that required the same for local redistricting, transparency and fairness, et cetera, at the local level. So it's definitely something to be on the agenda. Well, with that, we're going to, again, be respectful of your time and close down. Ken, do you want to bring up our last slide and we'll let folks know what's coming? So we will have another town hall. We have it scheduled for September the 12th, and we are really excited because we are working with some partner organizations right now to actually do a full statistically valid poll to see what you and voters all across the state of Georgia feel is important related to redistricting and redistricting reform. So we're working with the League of Women Voters of Georgia, the ACLU, and Common Cause. And we will have those results ready to be made public and share with you all on September the 12th. And I think you'll find the questions interesting. And again, hopefully, as we show what Georgians want, that's something that we can use in discussions with legislators yet while we're working on this pledge project and as we plan for the conversations when the legislature comes into session in January. So remember to follow us on social media. We would appreciate your support. We are a completely volunteer organization, and making use of your dollars for things like being able to do this poll that we're doing is really important. So please join us, mark the date on September the 12th. And there is, I believe, in the chat, an evaluation. You'll also get that by email after this. We always appreciate your thoughts in terms of the program and what can be improved, and any topics and so forth that you're interested in us covering in future town halls. So with that, we will say good night and thank you again for joining us this evening.